Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in the stream. Today, do sporting events create an environment more prone to violence and racism? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here with us, ready to share your live feedback. Tweet her your comments using the hashtag AJStream. Joining her on the couch today is Ben Carrington, sociology professor at University of Texas, Austin. Ben, welcome to the stream. Great to have you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Remember, you can always keep in touch with us on our Twitter page. Tweet us your feedback using your ideas or giving us your ideas for future shows and use the hashtag AJStream. The sporting world is synonymous with competition and aggression among players, but all too often that behavior transcends the boundaries of the field and makes it to the stands. Antagonistic actions that would be frowned upon in everyday life are praised by some as fans erupt into melees, riots, and fights over a game. In one example, a Romanian football fan ran onto the field and punched a player from the opposing team. The outburst triggered even more violence and forced the game to be called off. The hit was so strong that the player was hospitalized with a broken cheek. Social media has also played its part. Tools like Facebook and Twitter have given spectators a platform to express their anger. After San Francisco 49ers Kyle Williams dropped the ball during an American football playoff game, he immediately began receiving death threats on Twitter. Let's take a look at some of the things that people said. Here we have at Hav Pascal saying, "I hope you, your wife, kids, and family die. You deserve it." Then at Mr. J7 says, "Hey, Kyle Williams 10, you suck, you dumb blank. I hope you die. You suck, you suck, you suck. You blew the game twice." Another one coming up. "I hope you die in your sleep tonight." This is just an example, but it's not only violence that increases during sporting events, but racism as well. In numerous instances, bananas have been thrown at black players during matches. Across European stadiums, it's all too common to see fans holding banners with offensive racial slurs. So, what is it that makes fans behave this way? Here to help us explore some of these issues is Sean Gregory, sports writer for Time Magazine. Also with us is Piara Pawar, executive director of the Football Against Racism in Europe network. Welcome, gentlemen, to the stream.
Hi.
So, Piara, I want to start with you actually, just to get some perspective. What do you believe is at the root of some of the, what some would say is hooliganism or antisocial behavior that we see at sporting matches?
Well, I think it depends on what you're talking about specifically. If you're talking about hooliganism and violence, then some of that obviously comes about through the sort of territorial nature of football, in particular, and other sports. If you're talking about racism, then I think that's a slightly different phenomena, but it's often linked to violence and that tribal culture. But one thing's for sure, I think in some places you could say that where there is a vibrant culture inside stadiums, where fans are active, fans are in many ways insulting each other, you could say that that's quite a healthy environment. It's when it spills over into sort of pure violence or pure racism that I think you have to draw the line and say that that's gone too far.
So, Sean, are the lines not blurred when it comes to sporting events? How do people know what is and what is not appropriate?
I don't think the lines are blurred at sporting events. I think what happens is the group mentality also kind of kicks in. You're anonymous, and there have been a lot of studies done that, you know, one reason why fans go to events is to act out anger, to act out their feelings. So you can't behave like you're mad at work. You can't go in and punch your boss, but you can go in and scream and yell at a sporting event, and that screaming and yelling, and it gets into a crowd situation. You're one of 30,000, 40,000 people. You think you can get away with acting out on it. And it'll be interesting if this continues, because with social media and cell phone cameras and the ubiquity of media, you know, how much more can people, or will people feel comfortable getting away with this stuff when they can be caught on camera?
Well,
you know, with cell phones and stuff like that.
You're bringing up a great point, because we have here caught on camera. I'm just showing a little bit of footage from a Egyptian football game. We've all heard about this. 73 dead in rioting in Egypt between two teams. And 1,000 people injured. A really frightening scene. Malika, I know that you had a chance to speak to some people. Talk to us about what you learned.
Exactly. Well, I spoke to a couple of what they're called ultras in Egypt, and this is before the Port Said match. This is a few months ago. But basically, they were saying that the mentality is a group mentality, but it's because there's a brotherhood, there's a shared community amongst soccer fans. So it's more than just hooliganism. They definitely don't like that term. And I'm wondering, Ben, if you'd like to speak to that notion of, this is a group commitment, so to speak.
I mean, undoubtedly, part of the attraction of sports and football in particular is the emotive aspects. I mean, they're exciting spaces. They're spaces where people can engage in actions and activities that otherwise wouldn't be allowed in wider society. For the most part, so many of us, if we go to the grocery store, we can't start shouting or singing. We'd get arrested. So there is something about sports which allows for the kind of suspension, if you like, of the normal codes and modes of behaviour that are permissible in wider society. And we increasingly live within societies which are, there's a kind of safety consciousness about what we can and can't do. So there's something exciting about the taboo aspects of how we can behave in the sports stadium. I think you're right, and an important part of that actually isn't so much that people lose their identities when they become part of the crowd, they gain an extra identity. So it's not that they suddenly aren't who they were before and they lose it to the crowd, but that crowd mentality and the crowd culture, the subculture if you like, gives them an extra dimension to who they are. And that's really powerful. So we have to be a bit careful sometimes when people use expressions like they completely lost who they were. Well, they still knew who they were, but there's something extra that they kind of add on to that.
Well, it's a permissive environment. They're able, as you mentioned, to act out in ways that might not be acceptable, say, in a movie theater. I encourage people to sing in movies. I do so when I can, but everyone doesn't necessarily like that. Malika, what kind of things are our community saying?
I think that lends very nicely to this question from Brennan Lowry, who says that, the things that we're seeing are unique to sports. You don't see this happen in other places. And Piara, I wonder if you could listen to this question and respond to Brennan.
When was the last time you heard about a riot killing 70 people at a play or a concert or an art gallery or like a library where people are studying? I don't think that happens anywhere but sporting events. My name is Brennan from New York City.
I think that's a very good point. It's interesting that I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, Kevin Keegan, who was a great player here in the UK, in Germany as well, and became the England coach. And as he was, I think he was joining Newcastle for the second time as a coach, and he said, up here, i.e. the Northeast, which is quite a gritty place in England, there's a great love of football. He said, up here, we go to football, and down south, i.e. in the wealthier, sort of warmer part of the country, maybe they go to the opera. So for him, it was a clear distinction. It was almost a class distinction. This is what we, the working classes, do. We go to football. We're raucous. We're real. We touch the earth, if you like. And down south, people there go to the opera and indulge themselves in high art. So I think the question is absolutely right, that you go to the theatre, there are different codes of behaviour, different types of behaviour acceptable, and a different engagement with literally in a theatre, the actors on the stage, but generally a different engagement with the thing that we are seeing. And I think, we don't even question going to the theatre and behaving like you would in a sporting environment. Just doesn't even come up, really.
So then, Sean, I want to come to you. Here we have a tweet that says gangs have more of a role fueling sports-related violence than social media does. This has been true of Niners-Raiders games in San Francisco. Piara just brought up this issue of class distinction. Is there to some degree where social dynamics that exist outside of the field are brought to and amplified in the stands?
Yeah, definitely, and the San Francisco example is good. And it's, here in the States, some teams have taken some extreme measures to curb. In Philadelphia, for example, which has the notoriously rowdy and mean fans, they built a jail at Old Veterans Stadium, and that helped curb things. So, sometimes you have to be really, really aware of this stuff. And just to piggyback a little bit on the last question, I think one thing we should mention is the mix of alcohol here. I think alcohol really helps fuel this stuff. I know in some theaters, I think you could probably get a glass of wine or something, but there isn't a tailgating culture. People don't, sit outside in the parking lot and really load up. So I think that there's a dangerous mix of, you're in a huge crowd, you're yelling and screaming anyway, and then once alcohol's involved, too much alcohol is involved, things can get really, really bad.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of it does come to context because I've been to performances where the audience is expected to participate, where there's a call and response, there's an interactive sort of sensibility, as opposed to others where you're designed to be an observer. So some of it is the context, and obviously alcohol can, you know, be an accelerant to all kinds of different things. Let's see more from our community.
I'll direct this one at you, Ben, and this is the sense of honor, and does that play a role in fueling this kind of violence?
Hi, I'm Bryn from Duluth, Minnesota. The question of violence at sporting events, I think, is rooted in the historical fight of honor. And from there, I think it depends on how individuals involved define honor. Is it violent or nonviolent? And if you don't define it, I think the mob mentality phenomenon takes over, leading to fast escalation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's partly what we've been discussing, this suggestion that in many ways that the types of activities that we label as fan violence are very much tied to forms of identity and very much tied to local identities as well. So it's on in terms of protecting a certain space or a certain part of the city, especially in English context around soccer hooliganism. But we also kind of need to think about this in terms of gender as well. So it's interesting that I think Brian used the term honour. We often think about honour in terms of certain forms of masculinity and certain types of masculine pride. So one of the dynamics in which we need to kind of consider is the extent to which these types of violence and these occurrences often take place at men's sporting events, and often primarily the actors are men as well, often engaging in acts of violence towards other men. Mm-hmm. And so there are kind of very complex ways in which sports provide a very public and an important domain for the expression of certain types of hegemonic masculinity or dominant forms of masculinity. And when they clash, that's often when we see these types of violence. And therefore there's questions, as Pira talked about as well, how kind of race and also homophobia get mixed into this.
Well, it's interesting they bring up gender because in our research we were finding a report that was indicating that incidences of domestic violence after certain kinds of sports events were going up to 10% in certain communities. And I want to get to that issue you brought up about people defending their territory. And I want to bring this to you again, Piara, because how does that idea of defending your territory, your identity, your group, explain or is referenced in the incidences of racism, which we've seen in many parts of Europe when it comes to sporting events that one would think had nothing to do with race?
Well, I think let me just take a step back and in many ways reiterate a point that Ben's made, which is that there is always a dominant culture in certain sporting environments, and here in Europe we're talking about the football culture, the soccer culture. And if I can give the example of Italian ultras who have a bad reputation actually, but it's not always justified. But they own what the Italians call the curva, a stand. There are 2 stands, or 4 stands obviously, but the 2 in the middle are the sitting down seats, the expensive seats. At the end you have the more sort of gritty fans. And they're, in its purest form, they try to out-sing the other side. They try to unfurl banners at the strategic moments to try to, that is almost like a call and response type thing. This is what we stand for. This is what we're going to sing about. What's your response? Oh, you don't have a response, so let's come again with some more. So there is there is a codified way that football fans will recognize immediately what's going on and see that. And often that's got nothing to do with violence. It's got nothing to do with racism or any other sort of pernicious elements of that. But sometimes, yes, there grows up a culture in some places where racism is part and parcel of a fan group and the way that they express themselves within a football stadium. And sometimes that can be on a mass level. I think we saw an example of this at a Champions League game, which is the sort of highest level of European football last week, when players from Manchester City who had travelled away to Porto in Portugal, their black players were abused through monkey chants and so on. And sometimes it happens through individuals who, can't resist abusing a black player because he will be different. And often fans who don't get why this is wrong will say, well, we're just trying to put off the opposition. We're just trying to put off their best player. He happens to be black. if he'd had red hair, we would have called him something relating to his hair. If he'd had a big nose, it would have been on the basis, we would have abused him on the basis of his big nose. In fact, that just ignores the sensibilities around race and the importance around race. You know, being racially abused is very different to being told you've got a big nose, as I have, for example. It's a completely different thing. And so I think sometimes it's very much down to the local situation. And in some countries, again, going back to Italy, often the political rhetoric is around race. Politicians are making a big deal about new immigrants coming in. So football fans, playgrounds, the streets will often reflect that as well. So I think we have a number of different causes. And the fact that football offers a mass, if you like, a mass exposure to these ideas is often one reason why these ideas are played out.
I want to switch to another sport, in this case basketball, and those of us who are watching NBA games are very much familiar with the phenomenon of Jeremy Lin. I can't even describe the amount of hyperbole and corny metaphors and comments that have been used to describe the quote-unquote Linsanity that's been going on with this 23-year-old player, Harvard graduate. He's with the Knicks, he's a point guard, and has been leading them. 7-game streak was broken a few days ago, but they're continuing to win again. Now, ESPN got in trouble because they had a post on their website which was headlined, "A Chink in the Armor. Jeremy Lin's 9 turnovers cost Knicks in streak-snapping loss to Hornets." And for most of us, we look at this and we see a racially insensitive and negative commentary. But even within the office, we're having a significant debate because the person who wrote this was fired, which I personally think was correct. But we're having a debate upon, well, what is the context that allowed that to happen? And Sean, I'm curious, is it possible that there's such an insensitivity in certain contexts to racial dynamics that even when people are looking at an athlete that has been largely lauded in the media, they still wind up using negative stereotypes to describe them?
Yeah, and Lin's an unbelievable case. You know, we profiled him 2 years ago when he was at Harvard, and he was called all kinds of racial slurs, even by opposing players. Now, why wasn't more made of that? You know, and why is that acceptable in 2010? And that didn't get a ton of a ton of outrage, because I think in part maybe because it's such a new phenomenon with the Asian American star. We just didn't know how to handle it. So it's amazing that that's still acceptable. And the ESPN headline, you know, the man who wrote it said it was an unfortunate slip of words. You can believe him, you cannot believe him. But I agree they took the right action, and you've just got to be more aware. Just because something is new and you can make, you know, because there's an Asian American star and there's these stereotypes of Asian Americans not being good athletes, that you can just, you know, propagate them now, shows us an amazing lack of self-awareness from people.
All right, Sean, I know you had some comments about this particular topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a good example of how we often like to think about sports as being post-racial. Whenever anybody wants to give an example of how we've achieved a meritocratic society, we point to sports. We look at Tiger Woods and others breaking down boundaries. But I think there's a good argument to be made that actually sports are perhaps the most racialized space we have in society. And so when you do have someone like Jeremy Lin come into a realm whereby there's not expected to be an Asian presence, if you look at the deeply racialized language that's used to describe him, and the fact that he was overlooked for so many years is a good example of that. And Sean makes a good point. If you actually look at Lin's career, he was an outstanding high school player, but yet he was overlooked. And he went to Harvard, and he played outstandingly at Harvard, and yet he was overlooked. And then he played great in the summer leagues, and yet he was overlooked. And at each point in his career, he was demonstrating on the courts that he could be a top player. But for some reason, he was overlooked. And what's been fascinating to me in these discussions is that reason is known. It's because he's Asian.
Yeah, well, that's the other funny thing about it, is that nobody acted funny or thought it was amazing that he went to Harvard. That was never the issue. The fact that he went to Harvard seemed to make sense. The fact that he was a good basketball player is where there seemed to be some sort of cognitive dissonance. And you see these images like this one on my screen where they're calling the Knicks good fortune. Sounds like a positive thing, but here he is emerging from a fortune cookie. Lots of dialogue coming on online about this topic. What kinds of stuff are you seeing, Malika?
Well, I'll start with this tweet from the other Rizman, who says, "Sports arena is an athlete's workplace. We don't tolerate taunts to workers, race, ethnicity, religion in an office. There's a double standard." But picking up on something you said earlier, Ben, Michael Bliss Skypes in and basically says that there's always been racism in sports, and there's a history of this. Let's listen to this.
In reality, sports haven't changed in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. When you look at how sports have always been divided up amongst nationalistic pride, race, either religion, from the Romans to the Aztecs, it's relatively always maintained the same spirit of racism.
Piara, I'd like to actually switch to you, because off the back of that, there's this tweet from Ali Glinnex, who says there's so much racism in society, sports can be part of the problem, but also part of the solution. So I'm wondering what can be done, and what's the future?
Well, I think actually, as Ben has already said, that sometimes sport is seen as an exemplar of the way in which we can appreciate diversity. Because look, here in Europe, if you look at the cricket fields, if you look at the football fields, the rugby fields, you will more likely find more diversity, more black and white players playing together, more Asians playing with white players and black players than you will in the average workplace, and that's a reality. But at the same time, as Ben has said, that is a mirage in many ways. There is a sort of a falsity to saying this is the best sort of diversity that we can highlight, because as with the Jeremy Lin case, I think within that people are stereotyped. People are seen to act according to stereotype. Coaches see them in stereotypes. Managers see them in stereotypes. And I think that's the big issue that we're facing here in the UK, for example, which is the whole stereotyping, for example, of Asian footballers. And the stereotype goes that they're not good enough, that their diet is not good enough. Many of the similar stereotypes that Jeremy Lin would have faced as a basketball player.
Piara, I want to jump in there because there's another issue that I want to add in addition to race, and that is that of, I want to dive a little deeper into class. We got this email from @EE4AS that said, violence tends to occur in sports supported by the working classes, which makes one ask if it's allowed to happen. I want to continue asking that question when we come back. We're going to continue that in our post show, but first let's go to Malika, who's got some of the leads that we're following right now.
This story is out of the Spanish city of Valencia. It comes from Oscar Carrion, who tweeted, "Spanish police rioting inside a high school in Valencia. Students are protesting because they have no heating. Many kids injured." Well, in this YouTube video from Monday, riot police can be seen chasing and beating students who were protesting against spending cuts. A police spokesman told one news agency that authorities acted to restore order in the city. But the clashes have sparked an angry outcry online, with activists using the hashtag Primavera Valenciana, or Valencia Spring. Jonas Candalija posted this tongue-in-cheek tweet, "Another picture of a student threatening state security, the enemy." Our next story comes out of the US, where users of the aggregating site Reddit are drafting legislation to protect web freedom. It's a response to recent attempts to restrict online sharing. And lastly, new research indicates the ties formed on Twitter are often based on geographical similarities, contradicting conventional wisdom that social media expands our world. Out of curiosity, we mapped the stream's Twitter community and found it's pretty global. You can vote these stories up or down on our website at stream.aljazeera.com/leads. Back to you, Derek.
Thank you, Malika, and thank you, Ben, for being with us on the couch. We're going to come back to Sean and Piara in just a moment. Thank you, our community, for being with us. This is a fascinating conversation. We definitely want to dive deeper into it. You can be a part of it at stream.aljazeera.com. On Wednesday's show, is Islam too taboo for social media? We'll discuss a so-called case of Twitter blasphemy in Saudi Arabia. In the meantime, the conversation on violence and racism in sports continues. Tweet us using the hashtag AJStream. We'll see you online. Welcome back. We're going to continue our conversation on violence and racism in sports. I want to come back to this particular question of class. And this is we left with this tweet from @EE4AS saying that violence tends to occur in sports supported by working classes, which makes one ask if it's allowed to happen. Response from @Nubia says, you won't get riots in tennis matches, that's for sure. But what do you mean you question if it's allowed to happen? I want to bring this to you, Ben. Why don't we see riots in tennis matches?
It's a good question about thinking about class and race in the context of violence. I think it also helps us to take a step back and to think about the extent to which, if you take in England, for example, rugby union is a very popular sport. It tends to be played by middle-class people, and it's horrifically violent. I mean, you see the players trading punches, they stamp on each other in a regular game. If a soccer player, which tends to be supported by the working classes, if a soccer player throws one punch, that's front page news.
Yes.
So there's an interesting aspect to this kind of class dynamic in which actually you can find some supposedly middle class sports which are more violent on the pitch than the working class sports, yet the working class fans seem to be more violent than the middle class fans. So it depends really where we're looking at. Are we looking at fan behaviour, or are we looking at the activities of the players
I think
themselves?
that's what they're getting at here is the fan behavior, because I'm curious, I mean, do you have riots at rugby games?
Not traditionally, no.
Yeah.
But also, maybe if we even think about how we conceptualise the violence, because we tend to focus on the subjective forms of violence, in other words, the physical forms of violence. This is much of what the conversation has been about. And they're clearly important because we can see them. But what we tend to forget are the systemic forms of violence or the structural forms of violence, or what we might refer to as objective forms of violence, which are kind of hidden. Now, you could argue, for example, if we take tennis as an example, it's true that you don't see, to the same extent that you historically have seen within soccer, tennis crowds, which are predominantly working class, which are middle class and white, having the same types of violent verbal outbursts towards the players that you see in other sports. And yet, if we look at the exclusion that takes place within tennis, for example, the fact that there were so few black players is one of the things that Venus and Serena Williams have had to fight for much of their career. Yeah. That actually that does a certain type of violence to those who don't fit the white middle class norm of tennis. So in terms of opportunities to play tennis, to become coaches, to be television presenters, to move up into the echelons, the structures of a sport. And we don't tend to see that, but we could, in a sense, think about that as denying opportunity or hurting certain groups of people as a form of violence, and we tend not to consider that. So you could argue just as easily that tennis, in that conceptualization, is as violent to those who want to get into tennis as the kind of more overt forms that we see from soccer fans.
You know, tennis is a complex issue, because one of the things that a lot of people used to raise to me is how you would see the dominance at a certain period of Venus and Serena Williams in particular, but you'd see advertisements of blonde European tennis players who are much lower ranked. And we've got our two Skype guests back, and PR, I'm not sure if you got to hear the point that Ben was just making on these ideas of violence that extend beyond simply the physical. I mean, is there some dynamic at play when you see certain sports, frankly, excluding people of certain backgrounds from being able to play? So, for example, something like tennis or arguably golf winds up being more of an upper middle class and predominantly white sport.
Yeah, well, I think we have a very bad record here in Europe of involving minorities and those that are visibly different in those sort of sports essentially that you can't play on the streets. And it's ironic to me that for example, the British authorities who deal with tennis here used a soccer player, a footballer, Ian Wright, who was very urban in his outlook, to promote tennis, and that just seemed pretty contradictory, using a footballer to promote tennis. And I think that told us a little bit about the lack of ideas that they had, and in many ways the dilemmas that they're facing in terms of how one can reach out beyond those that are traditionally able to afford the fees of joining tennis clubs and golf clubs and so on.
Interesting. So I want to come back to something, because it's all over Twitter, and this is the internal debate here at AJ Stream. I'm seeing a couple of things from @theotherisman, who we just had a tweet from. He's saying basically, do we write headlines often? Normal rules don't apply. And this is specifically in regards to the ESPN question with Jeremy Lin. He says it's a clever play on words. Was he really calling Lin a quote unquote chink? Where is the motive? Then we also have a response now coming from at Lois Naim saying on Twitter that, you know, if he knew it was a racial slur, firing him was right. If not, suspension or perhaps a history lesson. I'm curious. I have my own strong opinions on this, but I want to get yours, and I want to come to you there. Sean, do you feel like the punishment fit the offense in the case of the ESPN writer?
Man, that's a tough one. You know, let's take him at his word for a second, okay? Let's take this guy at his word that he. Now, you say something in casual conversation. That phrase has been used casually in a long time, you know, for a long time, and you put it in a headline, and you think, okay, whatever, he had a bad game. We're just going to make this clever thing, and you forget that phrase is offensive, especially in that context. I feel bad for the guy. I really, really do. I mean, he made a mistake, a horrible mistake. I assume ESPN is having trouble believing that because that it was right in front of him. It was on the screen. I think if he had said it, if you say, you know, the anchor who said it by accident got suspended, didn't get fired. But I think people are having a hard time believing that the guy had no idea what he was writing could be interpreted as offensive. So, you know, so that's why I can't really totally disagree with ESPN's stance on that. But, you know, I mean, I feel either way, well, not either way. If he did it intentionally, it's bad. But if it was accidental, you feel bad for him. But again, you know, seeing it up on the screen as a headline writer, you got to wonder how he missed that. And maybe ESPN justified it by saying, you know, if he missed that, then maybe we're worried about his competency to do the job. I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to guess what ESPN might be thinking.
Your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Sean makes a good point. I mean, there's a slip of a tongue, which you might do. I don't see how you do a slip of a keyboard, type up something, look at, spell check it, and post it onto the internet. But I also think, in some ways, focusing on the individual kind of misses the broader picture. In other words, the discussion I would like to have is, well, what is the culture of ESPN in terms of allowing this to happen in the first place? So rather than focusing on one individual who may have not have had racist intent, and when we can never really truly know that, we tend not to look at issues, say, of who are ESPN employing, who are in the production offices, who's in the editorial offices. And what you tend to find is overwhelmingly these mistakes happen when you have an overwhelmingly white staff. And for them this may be slightly humorous, or it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, whatever it may be. And I think that aspect is often missed out.
So I think that is a great point, because the first time I heard about it, I was instantly like, that's crazy. And if I was working in that office, I'd be like, do not do this. And I think a lot of people from various minority groups will see the potential slippery slope. I'm not going to show the tweet here because it's got some language in it that's very frank, and that is not, you know, according to our standards and practices. But person is tweeting that, you know, with that logic, it's just fine to call a black person blank in a headline, clever play on words, right? I mean, it's used colloquially. It happens. Maybe they just didn't understand the magnitude. It seems like there's a lot of sensitivity around this issue, but journalists are held to a higher standard. Malika?
We're talking a lot about racism, but something that we've brushed on in the main show is something that Twitter user Bibak brings up. He says it's not only race, time to talk about anti-homophobia in sports too. And I'm wondering, Ben, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, Pure Power has been one of the central figures in the UK in terms of trying to address the question of racism within sports, first with the Kick Racism Out of football campaign, which started in '92 and then turned into the Kick It Out campaign. And one of the things that the anti-racist groups in sports in England have tried to do is to actually address questions of homophobia as well. And often the two are quite interrelated. So the way in which you might try to kind of undermine a player is to use a mixture of homophobic and racist language. I think there have been great strides in addressing the more overt forms of racial abuse, although they haven't died away. And this is one of the things we have to kind of keep in mind is there's been progress, but it hasn't disappeared. As recent examples that Pura talked about with Manchester City players last week, and even some of the Manchester City players, Mikey Richards, for example, being constantly racially abused on Twitter to such an extent that he's closed down his Twitter account. So those types of anti-black forms of racism are still very prevalent, but at least there's a contestation. I think sports have been very slow to acknowledge the deep-seated nature of homophobia. And I think it's paradoxical, just as we talked about earlier, that sports are interesting precisely because they're a space which people kind of use as an example that we've reached some kind of post-racial settlement, and also we find overt expressions of racism. Sports are probably one of the most profoundly homosocial spaces that you're going to engage in, and also at the same time deeply homophobic. So I think that this is why we do require kind of a complex way to kind of theorize and conceptualize the interrelationships between forms of race, gender and sexuality, and how violent expressions get normalized in these spaces. And therefore it's also a place where we can contest it as well. I think that's really important.
This is an interesting point because one of our producers had a conversation with an NFL Pro Bowler for the Ravens, a linebacker by the name of Brendan Ayabadejo. And he has been an outspoken advocate of sort of, a more tolerant environment in American professional sports, specifically campaigning against homophobia. Now, one of the things that he brought up in our interview with him was just this idea of the brotherhood in the locker room. And I want to bring this to you, Piara, since we're diving a little deeper into this. That sense of brotherhood, that sense of trust in the locker room, do you feel that these ideas of homophobia break that trust amongst players, or is it coming from outside of the teams? More specifically, what I'm saying is, do you feel like the ideas of team bonding transcend issues of race and homophobia, or are these issues coming from the outside in?
Well, listen, I think in terms of the way professional athletes talk about their work, it's quite clear that they see and respect others for their actions on the field of play. That is where you make judgments, or one makes judgments about athletes and their competence to do their job. That is what determines their paycheck, the fact that they get a paycheck or at all, or how much is in that check. So I think in the end, the space that we're trying to push this debate to is to say, look, if you can perform on the field of play, then genuinely sport should be, as far as possible, a meritocracy. You perform on the field, doesn't matter what your racial background is, doesn't matter what your ethnic background, your religious background, and crucially, it doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is. So I think in that sense, like a lot of these things, we're dealing with prejudices and obstacles and issues that are, in the end, social constructs. These are not things that people sort of grow up feeling or sensing. And it's interesting, a good friend of mine is John Amici, and it's quite interesting the reaction that he had after he brought out his book and where he outed himself and his experiences in the NBA.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to leave it there. This is a fascinating conversation. Sean and Piara, I want to thank you both very much for being with us. And Ben, we really appreciate you taking the time. Malika, wonderful job getting our community involved. And thank you for participating in this conversation. It will continue, as always, online. Tweet us using the hashtag AJStream or jump on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJStream. You will find all the videos we showed you today and much, much more on our own website. Go to stream.aljazeera.com. As always, we'll see you online.